Christmas Day, we cannot help but think of those for whom the devastating effects of conflict in the Middle East.
Behind Camilla's smile. I had always known Camilla's smile was her most practiced weapon. To the public, it looked effortless, soft eyes and open laugh, the kind of expression that suggested comfort rather than command. But within palace walls, I saw the calculation behind it. She wore that smile as one wears armor, deploying it when criticism loomed or when suspicion rose. And the day I stumbled upon the draft papers related to the king's will, that smile took on a darker meaning. The discovery came almost by accident. I had been reviewing correspondence with legal advisors concerning estate protocols when a draft crossed my desk. At first glance, it seemed routine clauses addressing charitable trusts, ceremonial inheritances, the usual language of continuity. But tucked between the lines was an omission so glaring it chilled me. Provisions for Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte had been struck out. Their names, once clearly present in earlier drafts, were gone. The ink was neat, the deletions deliberate, and in the margins, initials unmistakably tied to Camilla's confidantes. In that moment, the warmth of Camilla's smile transformed in my memory. I remembered how she had leaned close to Charles during dinners, whispering reassurances, promising to protect the crown's dignity. I remembered how she charmed visitors, speaking of family unity and the importance of legacy. Yet here was evidence that behind the charm lay ambition sharp enough to carve children out of inheritance. It was not the smile of a grandmotherly figure. It was the smile of someone who understood influence so deeply that she believed she could shape succession itself. Publicly, Camilla's rehabilitation had been portrayed as one of the great narratives of the modern monarchy. The BBC chronicled her transformation from tabloid villain to accepted consort, highlighting her charity work and careful avoidance of controversy. Reuters pointed to gradual gains in public opinion, noting that while she was never adored, she had become tolerated, even respected by some. But these assessments always missed one truth: acceptance built on charm is fragile. It can vanish the moment ambition is revealed. And here, in the margins of a will, ambition had overstepped. I wrestled with the implications. Cutting Louis and Charlotte from the will was not just a financial maneuver, it was symbolic. It suggested an effort to consolidate power and resources to reshape the monarchy's future around chosen heirs while diminishing others. Historically, such moves had sparked crises. The exclusion of royal children in wills and settlements had fueled feuds stretching back centuries. The Times once detailed how disputes over Queen Victoria's estate lingered for years, straining family bonds long after her reign. Camilla's maneuver risked repeating history, undermining the very stability she claimed to defend. When I confronted the reality of what I had read, I thought back to smaller signs I had ignored. Her subtle corrections in conversations about inheritance, her guarded tone whenever younger royals were mentioned in connection with ceremonial duties. Even her choice of language, speaking of streamlining rather than supporting, now seemed less like pragmatism and more like intent. The will draft was not an accident. It was the culmination of a strategy. For William, the discovery was personal. His children were not just heirs, they were his blood, his hope for continuity, the living embodiment of Diana's legacy. To see their names struck out was an affront that went beyond money or titles. It was an attack on family itself. I could see the storm gather in his eyes when I showed him the document. No matter how many times Camilla smiled, no matter how softly she spoke of unity, her actions had betrayed something deeper. Behind the smile, then, was the truth I could no longer deny. Camilla was not simply a consort surviving on charm. She was a player in a game of legacy, willing to redraw lines etched in tradition. The draft will was her mask slipping, her calculation exposed. And once exposed, no smile, however warm, could cover it again. Power, access, and the will. The draft I held in my hands was more than paper. It was the purest evidence of how access could be transformed into action. Camilla had always been close to the king, and through that closeness, she gained the privilege of proximity to decisions few others even glimpsed. At first, her influence appeared benign. She shaped schedules, steered conversations away from tension, and ensured Charles felt supported in the face of relentless public scrutiny. But when I saw the omissions in the will, I realized that what had begun as soft influence had crossed into the domain of hard action, an attempt to redirect inheritance itself. The monarchy has long wrestled with questions of succession, wealth, and duty. The crown's assets are complex, divided between personal estates like Sandringham and Balmoral, the Duchy of Lancaster, and the Crown Estate, which is technically held in trust for the nation. The will, then, was not only a private family matter, it was a document loaded with symbolism. Striking out the names of Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte was not simply an administrative edit. It was an assertion of who mattered and who did not in the future architecture of the royal family. I thought of historical precedents. Reuters once ran a piece outlining how disputes over wills and inheritances had destabilized monarchies across Europe. From the Habsburgs to the Romanovs, families fractured when property and privilege were unequally distributed. Even in Britain, Queen Victoria's own estate left lingering disputes that damaged family cohesion for decades. Camilla's maneuver was walking straight into that same peril. It was astonishing that she, who had lived through scandal and survived public vilification, would risk repeating history's mistakes for the sake of consolidating her position. Her defenders might argue she acted out of pragmatism. In recent years, there has been a push to slim down the monarchy, a phrase popularized to address criticisms of cost and relevance. The Guardian reported extensively on Charles's desire for a leaner institution, one less burdened by peripheral roles and expenses. Perhaps Camilla believed excluding Louis and Charlotte from the will aligned with that philosophy. But there is a world of difference between streamlining duties and erasing children from inheritance. One is strategy, the other is betrayal. Public sentiment, I knew, would not tolerate such a move. Polling by YouGov consistently shows that while Camilla's acceptance has grown among older Britons, younger generations remain skeptical. For them, Diana is not just history, but myth, and William's children are living continuations of that myth. To attempt to cut them out was to strike at Diana's memory by proxy, a decision bound to ignite fury. International coverage would amplify it. The BBC would frame it as constitutional strain. Deutsche Welle would highlight the damage to Britain's image abroad, and Al Jazeera would cast it as yet another symbol of monarchy's detachment from modern values. Inside the palace, the dynamics shifted almost instantly. Courtiers who once praised Camilla's steadiness began whispering about overreach. Staff who had once defended her as Charles's stabilizer grew uneasy. Influence, I realized, is a fragile currency. It multiplies when unchallenged, but collapses when tested by evidence. The draft will was evidence undeniable and damning. I remember one late-night conversation with a senior advisor, a man who had served through 3 reigns. He shook his head slowly, his voice heavy. "She has crossed from influence into intrusion," he said. "And that is a line no consort should ever step over." His words echoed my own fears that the monarchy's delicate balance of duty and family had been jeopardized by personal ambition. What unsettled me most was the calculation behind it. This was not a rash impulse. It was deliberate, drafted, reviewed, marked with the initials of her closest confidants. It revealed a confidence that her access to the king's trust gave her license to alter what should have been sacrosanct. But power without restraint corrodes, and access without accountability destroys trust. Looking at the will, I understood Camilla's influence was no longer about helping Charles bear the weight of the crown. It was about shaping what would remain after him. And in that pursuit, she had gone too far, turning the privileges of access into an attempt at rewriting legacy itself. Ambition against family boundaries. When William confronted Charles with the draft, the atmosphere in the room shifted from familial tension to something colder, almost judicial. The king sat behind his desk, the will papers spread out before him, his fingers drumming lightly, as if to delay the inevitable. Camilla stood nearby, her posture firm, her expression composed. She had faced scandal before, but this time the accusation was not from newspapers or protesters. It came from within the family itself. Her justification was immediate. She spoke of streamlining, of protecting the monarchy from overextension, of aligning with Charles's vision of a modern, efficient crown. Her tone was calm, almost reasonable. Yet as she spoke, I saw William's jaw tighten. To him, this was not about efficiency. It was about his children, about their place in a family defined by tradition and duty. No strategic argument could explain why their names had been crossed out of a will, why their inheritance had been sacrificed in the name of optics. The tension was unbearable. Charles, torn between loyalty to his wife and his duty as father and grandfather, looked stricken. He had long relied on Camilla's counsel, trusting her instincts when his own wavered. But now, her instincts had carried her into dangerous territory. The monarchy had always been a family first, and an institution second. To reverse that order was to hollow out its very foundation. History weighed heavily in that moment. The abdication crisis of 1936 had not simply been about Edward VIII's love for Wallis Simpson. It had been about the clash between personal desire and institutional duty. Camilla's move carried echoes of that same clash. Could she argue that her ambition was truly for the crown's benefit when it came at the expense of children? Could she defend altering a will when its symbolic weight extended far beyond finances? The more she spoke, the more it sounded like rationalization rather than principle. I thought too of Diana. Her legacy had always been intertwined with her defense of her children. She had once said her greatest role was to ensure William and Harry grew up understanding love beyond duty. To cut Louis and Charlotte from the will was not only to strike at William's family, but to dishonor Diana's memory. The BBC had aired countless retrospectives reminding viewers of Diana's devotion, her insistence that her sons experience ordinary life. Camilla's maneuver was the antithesis of that spirit-cold, calculated transactional. William's voice finally broke the silence. He did not shout, but his words carried an edge sharper than anger. "You speak of protecting the crown. But the crown is nothing without the family it represents. My children are not expendable." The weight of those words hung in the air, and for once Camilla's smile faltered. She recovered quickly, but I saw the flicker of realization her strategy had crossed not just a political line, but a personal boundary that could not be mended. International media would have devoured such a confrontation had it leaked. Reuters had previously noted how family feuds within monarchies often carried geopolitical consequences, shaping perceptions of stability abroad. Al Jazeera would have framed it as proof of monarchy's irrelevance in a modern world. Even Deutsche Welle, usually measured, would have portrayed it as yet another chapter in Britain's long struggle to reconcile tradition with transparency. The implications stretched far beyond the walls of that room, yet for me, the most profound impact was not political, but personal. Watching Camilla justify her actions, I realized that ambition unchecked by boundaries corrodes even the most carefully constructed image. She had survived scandal by presenting herself as a steady partner, as someone who restored balance to a wounded monarchy. But here, ambition had eclipsed loyalty. She had chosen power over family calculation, over compassion. And once that choice was exposed, there was no charm strong enough to erase it. In that moment, Charles faced his own test. To ignore Camilla's actions would be to betray his grandchildren and risk the crown's legitimacy. To confront her would mean undermining the woman he had defended for decades. The weight of that decision pressed visibly upon him. Camilla's ambition had not only crossed family boundaries, it had forced the king himself to choose between love and duty, between trust in his wife and loyalty to his bloodline, spin backlash and isolation. Once the confrontation broke open, Camilla's inner circle moved quickly to manage the damage. I watched how her advisors activated well-worn channels, friendly journalists, briefed that any draft of the king's will was preliminary, nothing more than routine paperwork, subject to endless revisions. A sympathetic columnist in The Telegraph published a piece within days, describing Camilla as a misunderstood figure, unfairly caught in palace intrigue. It was the same playbook she had used for years: redirect, soften, confuse. But this time the fire she was trying to smother was not outside speculation. It was a blaze lit by her own hand. The public was not easily distracted. News outlets began piecing together timelines drawing attention to Camilla's growing sway over Charles. The BBC noted how her role had expanded quietly in recent years, with access to decisions once reserved for senior courtiers. Reuters went further, citing palace sources, who admitted unease over her increasing involvement in estate matters. On social media, the backlash was immediate and visceral. Hashtags invoking Diana's name trended across platforms, with thousands reminding the world that William's children represented her living legacy. Inside the palace, the reaction was even more telling. Courtiers who had long aligned themselves with Camilla began to distance quietly. Invitations to private gatherings grew fewer. Conversation shifted when she entered the room. Even Charles's most trusted aides, men and women who had tolerated her influence for years, now whispered about overreach. The aura of inevitability around her authority was cracking. Her defenders, though fewer, were determined. They framed the issue as a misunderstanding, a technical edit blown out of proportion. They insisted Camilla had only been trying to streamline responsibilities, aligning with the king's long-standing goal of slimming down the monarchy. But even these defenses carried a hollow ring. To strike out names of children, real living heirs, was not streamlining. It was exclusion. And no amount of spin could change that fact. The isolation grew sharper as weeks passed. Camilla still appeared beside Charles at formal events. Her smile practiced her composure flawless. But I could see the subtle changes. The warmth in staff greetings cooled. The respect once given without question now carried hesitation. Even among her allies, there was recognition that something had shifted irreversibly. She was no longer the quiet stabilizer. She was the source of disruption. International media only deepened the pressure. Al Jazeera ran a segment describing Camilla as a queen consort caught between ambition and legacy, while Deutsche Welle questioned whether Britain's monarchy could sustain credibility if internal fractures widened. The Guardian published a scathing editorial about the dangers of unelected influence shaping generational inheritance. Each article chipped away at her carefully constructed rehabilitation, turning survival into isolation. I could not ignore the irony. Camilla had spent decades enduring humiliation, clawing her way back into acceptance through patience and charm. She had weathered the storm of public hatred, rebuilt her image with careful charity work, and eventually claimed a crown once unthinkable. Yet now, from within the palace itself, her influence was unraveling. She was not undone by tabloids or protesters, but by her own ambition crossing a line too sacred to defend. In private, I saw moments of defiance flicker in her eyes. She carried herself with dignity, refusing to admit defeat. But the isolation was unmistakable. Rooms that once bent around her presence now seemed indifferent. Allies grew scarce. And behind the practiced smile, I sensed the loneliness of someone who realized that survival, however long achieved, could not guarantee trust once it was broken. Camilla's spin had bought her time before. This time, it bought her only silence. And in that silence, isolation closed in, leaving her crown intact, but her influence in ruins. Reckoning legacy, what endures. The king's decision came in the quiet of his private study, not in the glare of cameras or the roar of parliament. He told Camilla she would remain queen consort, her crown safe by law and precedent, but her influence would be curtailed. Her access to estate planning, her direct involvement in family financial matters, and even her voice in certain ceremonial preparations would all be limited. It was not exile, but it was a deliberate narrowing of her role, a recognition that trust once broken could not be fully restored. For Camilla, the reckoning was as much about perception as it was about power. She had endured scandals before, yet always managed to survive them with patience and strategic silence. This time, however, survival looked different. She still stood beside Charles at state occasions, her smile as polished as ever, but the hollowness behind it was visible to anyone paying attention. The isolation that had begun with whispers now hardened into permanence. She had her title, but not the certainty of loyalty around her. Public reaction cemented that reality. BBC coverage presented the king's decision as a restructuring of responsibilities, but beneath the neutral language lay an unmistakable message Camilla had overstepped. Reuters highlighted the irony of a queen consort being symbolically sidelined so soon after coronation. Al Jazeera framed the affair as proof of monarchy's fragility in the modern age, where secrecy collides with transparency. And Deutsche Welle noted how the real strength of the institution now lay in William, Catherine, and their children, symbols of renewal untainted by scandal. For William, the reckoning brought a measure of vindication. His children were restored to the will, their place in the family secured. But it was not a victory he celebrated. To watch his stepmother reduced to see his father torn between love and duty left scars that no legal claws could heal. For him, Diana's absence had always been a wound. Camilla's attempt to erase her grandchildren from the will reopened it with a sharpness that would linger. In the weeks that followed, I often thought about what legacy Camilla would leave behind. She had survived ridicule, endured decades of public loathing, and against all odds worn the crown. Yet endurance alone does not create legacy. Her story would now be remembered not only for survival, but also for ambition that crossed boundaries too sacred to ignore. She had tried to reshape inheritance in ways that fractured trust, and though she remained queen consort, her influence was forever diminished. What endures then is not her authority, but the lessons drawn from her fall. The monarchy, an institution rooted in continuity, had reaffirmed its boundaries. Family comes before strategy, children before calculation. The public too had sent a message: acceptance is conditional and it evaporates when ambition threatens innocence. Camilla's reckoning ensured that future consorts would tread more carefully, aware that influence without accountability is a path to isolation. And yet I cannot dismiss her entirely as a villain. Camilla's life has been one of contradictions, vilified, yet enduring, mocked, yet crowned, sidelined, yet central. In her resilience, there is a kind of tragic strength. But history will not remember the resilience alone. It will remember the smile that hid ambition, the draft that revealed overreach, and the reckoning that stripped her influence while leaving her crown intact. As I close this account, I return often to the image of Diana's children, William's gaze sharpened by grief, Catherine's steady hand on his arm, George, Charlotte, and Louis unaware of the storm swirling around them. They represent what endures, what no will or draft can erase: legacy carried forward by love. Against that, Camilla's ambition faltered. The crown survived, but her place within it was forever changed.